Okay, welcome everybody. Can you hear me? Hi. My name is Gabe.
If you want
we
to
have to do a. Okay. A couple more people coming in. All right. Welcome. My name is Gabriel Kahn. I teach at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School for Journalism. With me is Ashley Talley. You want to tell them who you are?
I am an executive producer at WRAL News. We're the NBC and Fox affiliate television station in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay, so we're going to talk about how we use a system of hyperlocal data to generate local and hyperlocal news. Just so we don't bury the lead here, this is essentially what we do. We take data and turn it into hyperlocal news, and we do it at scale. By scale, I mean that with a small newsroom, you can create massive amounts of hyperlocal news tailored to individual communities. So just to be clear here, this entire project is based on trying to correct one of the great problems that we have, which is the lack of a sustainable business model for local news. I think everybody here knows how essential local news is and how without it, there's so much research that shows that voter turnout declines, fewer people run for elections, local corruption increases, et cetera, et cetera. And yet it is so difficult to maintain a thriving local news ecosystem. So that's the problem that we set out to tackle. Now, our solution to that problem was looking at data and saying, what can data help us with in terms of doing the daily work required to gather and distribute news? So if you were to turn on the TV news, right, you would see stories about, in Los Angeles, you'd see stories about traffic, obviously. You'd see stories about crime, about housing. We have a housing crisis in Los Angeles. It turns out that there's data on just about all of those topics. Data that's generated by local government, local agencies, so on and so forth. Now, over the last few years, so much of that data has now become more publicly available. There are open data portals in just about every decent-sized city in the United States. This is also true in Canada and other countries as well. This data is publicly available. However, it's not very publicly accessible. These are just massive, massive spreadsheets that are online, and it's almost impossible for the ordinary resident to make sense of that unless you have a PhD in data science. Just so happens I work at a university which is full of PhDs in data science. So I really think of the local news crisis as an all-hands-on-deck problem. So it wasn't a problem that I was going to solve. I needed help. So this is really a collaboration that began with a bunch of computer scientists and some journalists. So we decided to take this publicly available data in Los Angeles and make it publicly accessible. So what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? So we scrape this data every day, and we store it in the cloud. So we have our own copy of the data. Now, every day, there are new records being added to this, new crime reports, new traffic violations, new building permits. And so every day, we scrape that same data, and our database gets longer and longer every day. And in that sense, it also gets more powerful. So we then take that data, and we elaborate on it. So for example, almost all the data that we collect has a location to it. There was a traffic collision on this intersection. A new building was approved for construction at this address, or a crime took place, at this store. So we then take that location data and we add another column, which is we group it by neighborhood. Now I'm talking about a city like Los Angeles. We have 4 million people, 110 neighborhoods, right? If we were just to take all that data and aggregate it for the city of Los Angeles, it would tell us one story. But when we actually can divide it up by individual neighborhoods, it tells 110 different stories. Because, as any real estate agent will tell you, location, 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 and your experience of a city like Los Angeles or Chicago or Seattle, a lot of it depends on where you live. So we then have not only a story of what's happening in the city, but what's happening in each neighborhood. So The big point about this, and to go back to the original sort of premise and the issue that we were trying to solve, is you're trying to bring down the costs of producing local news. Now, everybody here knows, and I think even the previous session addressed this, there's been so much effort on increasing the revenue for local news, which is also essential. Philanthropy, reader revenue, memberships, all of that stuff, crucial. There has been much less effort on bringing down the actual costs of producing that news. So that was our task. By collecting all of this data, sorting it, making it super easy to query, we bring down the costs of reporting. And by making it easy to query, and I'll do an example on this in a moment, what we're really doing is making a lot of heavy lifting data journalism as simple as doing a Google search. So in that sense, what we do is we turn every journalist in the newsroom into a data journalist. Now, I can't claim to be a data journalist. I'm basically a journalist who works with data. But we've created an interface with that data that's so simple that even I can do it. And we generate a lot of headlines looking at this data. We see things, we see trends before other people notice them. We can find inequities within Los Angeles. Also, the other thing about Los Angeles, media capital, Hollywood, all of that stuff, the city is still pockmarked with news deserts. There are vast sections of that city that never get news coverage. Or if they do get news coverage, it's the double homicide and the news truck rolls in and does the story and then leaves, right? So the fact that our data covers the entire city allows us to fill in all of those news deserts, and every neighborhood can get the same level of detail about what's happening in their neighborhood, right? So there's an equity component of that too. The other thing about the data is when you sort of stretch it out, and I'll show a live example of this in a moment, when you stretch it out, you can really start to see the inequities within a city, and you can illustrate those and demonstrate those, and they can be pretty stark. So, for example, we did a story about, and I'm sorry that these examples are so LA focused, about swimming pools. And of course, rich people have more swimming pools than poor people. But in the neighborhood of Sherman Oaks, in a 3-year period, there were 1,000 pools put into the ground. In that same period, the neighborhood of Watts had 1. So though we were expecting a discrepancy, we were not expecting 1,000 to 1 discrepancy between who has access to recreation in a city that's getting hotter and so on and so forth. So with the data, we're actually able to tell those stories that were hiding in plain sight before that the other news organizations can't. And let me just give a little quick demo on how this works. So here is our database of crime records in Los Angeles. Now that's 2.8 million rows of data. So that's, and every day we're getting about 600 more new records. So that's too much for, of course, any human to look at. But what we do is we organize it. So I want to say, you know what, I just want to look at the records between July and October 31st, July 2019, October 31st, 2021. And I want to look for stolen cars, okay? Let's just count them up and organize it by month. So when I do that, I immediately get a data visualization, which shows me a trend. Now this happened, this is something that we did at the very beginning of COVID because we were asking ourselves questions. Crime is going down because everybody's shut inside. Are there any crimes that are going up? Well, lo and behold, February 2020, 1,300 cars stolen. The next month, when lockdown begins, 1,500. And pretty soon we're over 2,142 stolen cars a month. And the trend continues. So here we see something that's sort of counterintuitive. We see one particular type of crime that's starting to rise at the beginning of COVID. And of course, at this point we have to be reporters and figure out, well, what is driving this? Part of it was that Los Angeles suspended parking regulations so people could park on the street for days at a time. Their cars were exposed and stuff like that. A few other reasons that drove this trend. But this trend continued to the point where, we had almost twice as many stolen cars in a month a year later as we had, before the pandemic. So the other element of this, of course, is that we can look at who's impacted by this. So here's that same data, but divided by neighborhood, right? Because we can say, hey, the city is in the midst of not only a pandemic, but also this stolen car epidemic. But let's see who's impacted by that. This is that same data broken down by neighborhood, and you can see, well, the neighborhood of Boyle Heights, which is in East Los Angeles, has the biggest stolen car problem. And yet other neighborhoods, Toluca Lake, Westmont, et cetera, the issue for them is much less pronounced, right? So now we get to see, everybody gets to see themselves represented in that data. And we get to tell stories at the neighborhood level about what's happening, and, which are much more accurate than what is posted on Nextdoor or a Facebook group or something like that, because it's data-based. I want to show you one other thing here in Los Angeles, just to show how when you have this data and you have access to this data, and it is so easy to ask a question of that data, how new sort of issues arise. So for example, California legalized marijuana for recreational use in 2018. There are now more marijuana dispensaries in my neighborhood than Starbucks. And so we asked ourselves, well, who's still getting arrested for marijuana since it's been legalized? And you can see here, it's 2016, there were almost 1,400 people arrested. The year before legalization, 531. Then we see the year it was legalized, 564, more or less the same. And so we see this downward trend. However, we also have the ability to look at this same data by race. So who is being arrested? What's the descent of each person who's being arrested? When we looked at it that way, all of a sudden, we see that in 2017, there were 163 black people arrested. The year that it was legalized, there were 238, and a few years later, there were 333, more than any other group combined. Now, black people make up about 8% of the population of Los Angeles, but about 60 or 70% of the people who are being arrested for marijuana. So here's this incredible racial inequity that's hiding in the data, right? And this allows us to bring this to the police department, to air that publicly, and to say, hey, a lot of the issues that marijuana legalization was supposed to address, such as this tremendous racial inequity in the way that policing works, are still present even after it's been legalized. So the other thing that I want to point out before I turn it over to Ashley is that when you actually are able to give small communities data about themselves, they really respond. So we did a story, most dangerous intersection in Los Angeles. Okay, so we just basically looked at all of the traffic collisions across the city and figured out which were the intersections where most collisions were occurring. Once we did this story, not only did it get a huge play around the city, but the people in Van Nuys reached out to us and said, thank you so much. We have been complaining about this intersection for ages and no one's been listening to us. Now you've put this in stark relief. We can go to our city council person, we can go to the Department of Transportation, we can say, this is a dangerous intersection, you have to fix the traffic signal, you've got to repave some of these roads, et cetera, because we have the data at our fingertips. And the data allows the community to be that squeaky wheel, right? And so what we find is that you get more community engagement, you get more local engagement, and more local impact, the sort of more local that data becomes, right? And you can sort of really see the good that you can do for that data. Another thing we did, again, we have a housing crisis in Los Angeles, a homelessness crisis. We don't have enough housing. There's a type of housing called additional dwelling units. It's basically converting your garage into a small apartment. We were able to figure out, well, which are the neighborhoods that are doing the most of that, which are the YIMBY neighborhoods, the yes in my backyard neighborhoods, and which are the neighborhoods that are basically not doing it, right? And can kind of almost sort of shame them. So we have that data to allow those neighborhoods to see how they're doing in addressing some of the bigger, broader social ills that the city's suffering from, and can therefore sort of bring some accountability to the local control about what they can do. Ashley. Ashley has been using a similar, so basically what we did was we felt that this was working in LA, so if it worked in LA, our next question was, will it work in other cities? So we rolled it out in North Carolina, in Raleigh with WRAL, and you want to talk a little bit about how that went?
Yeah, so it was a pilot program. We were the only television station, and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans was the only newspaper that did it. We came together monthly, went over stuff. Gabe trained me and my data reporter. and basically said, if there's a data set out there that you want, let me know, and we'll put it into the system. So along with crime, which we use a lot, we have, like Gabe said, building permits, accident locations, tax assessor stuff. So it just gives you a wealth of information at your fingertips that you're able to get. So there's not a lot of TV at this conference, I've noticed, which is really disappointing. So I'm just going to explain a little bit. If you don't know about television markets in the U.S., there are 210 markets divided by size, right? So New York is the biggest, LA is second. We're 23rd out of the 210, so fairly big, top 25 market. We have about 2.5 million people in our market. Not just our city. We are both NBC and Fox affiliate, and we're a legacy number one station, right? So we've, been there a long time. We've been number one for a long time, but we have a strong number two. The ABC station is really competitive, so we work really hard to try to differentiate our content. We do it in lots of different ways. So, yeah, it goes. So part of my team, I manage our enterprise content. So everything from investigative to podcast, climate change reporter, documentary unit, consumer, education, PolitiFact. We have all these units already, right, that differentiate us from our competition. But data is particularly important to us. If you follow U.S. politics, that it's a vast divide between red and blue, and North Carolina has really become purple over the past few years. And that divide is very clear, in our audience. We hear a lot from our audience that, oh, you liberal media, this, whatever. People can argue different sides of their own truths, but I always say you can't argue with data. And so it's really given us more trust, I think, from viewers showing, when we're able to say, no, actually, this is why, here are the numbers that this is based on. So one of my favorite parts of Crosstown is finding those stories within the data, because like you said, it's not just what one neighborhood has, it's looking at that neighborhood in relation to everything else. These are just a couple of things I pulled. We've had a spike in assaults that have been plaguing the city. We did most dangerous areas for cyclists, so where you're most likely to be hit if you're riding a bicycle in the city. Turns out it's near the biggest university. Allie Ingersoll is our data reporter, and she recently did a story about how femicide is up in Raleigh. 10 years ago, women made up like 5% of all those murdered, and we're up to like 25% this year. So, you're able to find stories within the data, but also around events that happen. So we had a quadruple shooting, one fatal. This was last year. Here are how others covered it. Man dies after quadruple shooting at motel. News and Observer. 1 dead, 3 injured. That's the ABC station there. Wake Inn. It's a local hotel. And this is how we were able to cover it. By using Crosstown, we found that it's actually the most dangerous block in all of Raleigh. 619 crimes over the past 5 years have happened in that one block. So we were able to give context to what otherwise would have been a one-off crime story. And that's probably how we use it most, so we trained all of our reporters. We have one reporter who just works overnight, and he's just a breaking news reporter. So his job is to go to the accidents, go to the crimes, go to the pedestrian struck. But by using Crosstown in his car, while he's driving around, not while he's driving around, but when he stopped at a crime scene, he can go to a pedestrian struck and say, yes, this person was struck last night, but 5 other people have also been struck in this block in the past 2 years. So it gives what can be, TV news has a bad reputation for bleeds, it leads, that sort of thing. But this helps us give depth and context to our coverage.
So the other thing that's I also just want to point out that we're now actually also doing something similar with WBEZ in Chicago. Chicago has amazing data. And just to give you an idea, one of the things that Chicago has is this 311 line where residents of Chicago can call up and file complaints. And so, for example, if you look at that, we can look at who's concerned about, say, lead in their water or lead paint or something like that, a huge health issue. We can easily figure out the neighborhoods in Chicago where those concerns are highest, right? So allowing them to then sort of really hyperlocate where these problems are. But I think what we learned from Ashley and others is that this is actually transferable. This can work in other markets as well. The other thing about data, of course, is that, listen, I'm a, dyed-in-the-wool newspaper reporter for many years, and sort of, give a man a hammer and everything's a nail. But for me, give me some data and I'm going to write 800 words about it. But there are so many other ways to distribute and illustrate this kind of stuff. Particularly, what's great about the data is that when you live in a multilingual environment like Los Angeles, data translates very easily, right? We can visualize this data, we can create dashboards with the same data that allow people to go access the data themselves and choose their own adventure. We try to have stories that are very visual, mobile friendly, because the data does tell a good story. And I certainly know that my attention span has shrunk over the past few years, and I imagine you have the same problem. Blame TikTok. The data visualizations really help us get that point across quickly. So in all of this, we also had this, what I thought, this great opportunity of being able to tell all these different hyper-local neighborhood stories. But what we didn't have was the great way of delivering it to those communities, right? So we can put out a story about, traffic collisions, or what's the worst neighborhood for parking tickets, or something like that, or where there have been the most cases of arson. But then we've got to ask our audience to come to that website, maybe scroll down to a table at the bottom of the story that has each neighborhood with the figures next to that neighborhood. That's asking a lot of the audience. So I simply went to the computer scientists and said, I've got a really difficult problem. And they said, great, tell me what it is. And I said, what if we could send out a newsletter that was automatically populated with the data and the data visualizations for every neighborhood in Los Angeles? So these guys built a platform that allows us to, every week, we send out 110, we have a newsroom of 4 part-time people, 2 of whom are full-time students. Every week, we send out 110 newsletters, 1 for each neighborhood in LA. Each one of those newsletters has data and charts and graphs that are specific and tell stories about that neighborhood, but we only write one version. So we write one version and automatically generate 110 different newsletters, 1 for each neighborhood. Those newsletters arrive with the name of the neighborhood in the subject line, so have burglaries in Van Nuys increased, ? Pretty much, if you live in Van Nuys, you're going to open that email. So we get an amazing open rate. We get an open rate above 80% every week, and an industry average of about 22%. What we have is just a simple sort of sign-up page where you put in your name, scroll down to the neighborhoods that you want to subscribe to, and then each week you get the newsletters for those neighborhoods. Now, then it comes to you, and we put a few different pieces of data in there. We've covered sort of COVID from the very beginning. We were able to tell people how many COVID cases there were in their neighborhood each week, because there were certain neighborhoods that were hot spots. There were certain neighborhoods that were doing pretty well. The audience has grown, and the engagement has continued. So I want to show for a second what that actually looks like, what this platform looks like. So here is our newsletter platform. So each week, we write something over here on the left-hand side, and you see how it sort of represents on the right-hand side. Every time you get to one of those green things, that's basically a variable that's going to be specific to the neighborhood that emerges. So it's kind of like writing a Mad Lib that's automatically filled in, right? And then we can choose, like, what do we want to put in there? We want to put in health. We want to put in, COVID infection rates per neighborhood over a particular time period. And we want to represent it as a table or a line chart or a bar chart, right? And once we actually print it, we get 110 different versions of that. So we can look at, say, what does this look like for Adams Normandy? And here's the number of complaints about homeless encampments in Los Angeles citywide. and here's what they look like for this particular neighborhood, right? And here's how that has changed over time. And then another neighborhood is going to have, a different set of data because, as we saw with car theft and things like that, different problems impact different neighborhoods differently. So, this neighborhood has many fewer complaints about homeless encampments. This is the number of new buildings that were permitted in this neighborhood over the past year, and so on and so forth. Here's how we just would cover COVID and infection rates each week, and so on and so forth. And so we do that 110 times. It costs us zero. There's no marginal cost for producing an extra neighborhood. It could be 10, 20, 110. In Chicago, we're going to do 77 because there's 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. And we're about to roll this out in Raleigh as well. So, Ashley, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. You guys probably get a lot of newsletters already, the Skim, Axios, maybe you get the Daily New York Times or Washington Post. It's a full market, but what those aren't offering right now is personalization. They aren't, you don't get it with your neighborhood and actual stats that affect your life in it. And so it's not just lowering cost, it's about potentially raising revenue as well. So we're a for-profit media company. We're not going to put a paywall up, but a high-tier membership program is something that we've been talking about. To do that, you need to have premium content. And Crosstown and this newsletter gives us the ability to do that. A very wise man named Gabe Kahn once said, people like to know how they compare to others, so it's not just knowing how my neighborhood is, it's knowing that, Mordecai is safer than South Park is, and people respond to that. This is a mock-up of our newsletter that we're going to launch in the next couple of weeks. I also really like how it's conversational. I mean, you write it a lot of times, and that's how simple it is. Gabe, and all he is doing can, make these 110 newsletters, so it's easy to do. They're easily templated. It varies, the focus varies. I get like 10 of Gabe's from LA, and I'm always fascinated at how different the subjects can be. One thing we've looked at recently is the number of $1 million homes that have been permitted, where those are being permitted in Raleigh, and we can compare that with the tax base there and see where gentrification is happening in real time, basically, and map that. Another feature he didn't show you, it's along with the bar graphs and everything, there's actually a visual, it's so easy, there's a visualization button, and you push it, and you get a graph. But you also can get a map, so you can check, almost like a heat map of where pedestrians are being struck or where $1 million homes are going up. So it's all really easy to use and easily digestible by people. So the low associated workload coupled with the potential for a revenue stream is what all media needs right now, right? And eventually we would like to have a searchable portal where these premium members can go and they can look up, whatever they want to, road projects, tax assessment, building permits and everything. And we've been talking about it, that this is a really perfect partnership with our local real estate industry that it's everything people want to know when they're moving to a place. So it's creating different avenues of revenue for us in different ways.
So one thing that we're trying to do here is, with the different newsroom partners that we work with, they have different revenue models, they have different business models. So for WRAL, there's the opportunity to create a premium tier. With WBEZ in Chicago, right, they live off donations from users. Being able to deliver people in Chicago a neighborhood level newsletter full of data is a great either treat for people who have donated or an enticement to donate. WBEZ is now also part of the Chicago Sun-Times, or vice versa, rather. So the Chicago Sun-Times is a subscription-based business model. So they can use a newsletter like this in an entirely different way in order to convert subscribers, keep them engaged, and so on and so forth. So we think that there's a lot of different revenue opportunities depending on the type of publication and how they want to use it, and that there's lots of different ways in which this can sort of be deployed in different markets. And again, you could run a Spanish language, Chinese language version of this in a major city without too much work, because you've got the data, the charts don't change, the data's still there. And so we're kind of excited about who else might be able to deploy this. Now, you need a certain size of a market in order to, because you need a certain concentration of data in order to make this work, but we find that there's easily more than 100 cities just in the United States alone that probably have that.
Well, LA has 110 neighborhoods, Raleigh has 17, but, you know, that's still.
And then you've also got Durham.
We
and
also have Durham and
Fayetteville.
Fayetteville. We're a tri-city market, yeah, and we have data from all of those places. So we're starting with Raleigh, but I think we'll definitely expand it from there.
Okay, so we definitely want to open this up to questions and hope that folks have questions about this. Now, of course, they can also be about AI, because when you have this amount of data, you obviously have some AI questions too. So I see some hands up there. Go right ahead.
So if I can say something,
Yes, please.
if you stand up your hands, I'm gonna pass, but I need to take the microphone, so I'm gonna make you talk, but I'm gonna keep the microphone. So just for COVID and for security. So please stand up. Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Sounds like a very interesting and exciting project. What I do want to know is, and to understand is, the actual workflow. And for example, how does it look like when different neighborhoods get different newsletters of different crime topics, for example? How does is that picked? Because I mean, you have a huge and vast amount of data, and try to find the needle in the haystack.
Mm-hmm.
What's the most relevant point there for this specific neighborhood, and that each week. So how do you differentiate that for every week and between every neighborhood? How does it work?
So excellent question. So basically, what we've done so far, we've tried to rotate these topics from housing to public health, general construction, again, even parking. And so each week we use about 2 or 3 different data points for the newsletter to give a little bit of variety. We could, of course, but it's choose your own adventure. You could report on the same data each week, and it's change over time if you like. Now, what you said is that absolutely, for some neighborhoods, stolen cars are a real problem, right? And other neighborhoods, it's not much of a problem. First of all, those neighborhoods still have a little bit of that problem, and they get to see how it has changed over time. We also show them a rank, where they rank. So we can tell a neighborhood, you are the 109th out of 110 neighborhoods for stolen cars, or the burglary rate in your neighborhood is X, and that is number 72 out of 110 neighborhoods, or something like that. So, but by rotating the data, changing it up, we generally try to hit, things that are relevant to every neighborhood. We also find that people often subscribe to more than one neighborhood. Maybe they work in one neighborhood and live in another. They're thinking about moving or something like that, or their kids live in a different neighborhood. So we do find that we've got multiple subscribers.
It can also be based on what's in the news right now. So like we had a carjacking where a baby was in the car, and so we're able to look at how many carjackings had happened. My favorite example of this is Lady Gaga's dog.
Yes. So Lady Gaga's dog was dog napped.
Big news. You guys don't remember?
Exactly. Sorry, this is like an episode of the Californians on SNL. I know. So one of the big questions was, how often do people's dogs get dog napped, right? And we're able to look that up in the crime data. And it just so happens that she was ahead of the curve, because after her dog was dog napped, there actually was a huge spike, because I guess there's some secondary market for French bulldogs out there. Someone on my own street was held up at gunpoint for their French bulldog. Just a word of caution to any visitors to Los Angeles if you want a French bulldog. But those things we can actually go off the news, talk about them, put some context behind them. And I will say that with crime reporting, because there is so much, problematic practices around the way that news media has covered crime, particularly in cities, what we're able to do is, so I would say that traditionally news covers crime by incident, which is very sensationalist, often racially insensitive and inaccurate. We cover crime with context. Because we have all of those in now 13 and a half years, 12 and a half years of crime data in Los Angeles, we're able to put those numbers in context. So yes, maybe there is a horrific event that happened. However, we can show that over several years, the frequency of those types of events have declined. So a lot of what we're doing when we report on crime data is trying to take the temperature down a little bit. Now, people don't always respond well to facts, but particularly in the United States, there's this phenomenon where people have these Ring doorbell cameras that, anytime anybody peeks at their, peeks into their home or something like that, there's a photo of it, they repost that on Nextdoor or Facebook, everybody gets freaked out. However, in many cases, a lot of these crimes, the incidents are going down. So we're there with this sort of corrective, oftentimes, that's data-based, that hopefully makes that kind of conversation less shrill and a little bit more fact-based. Other questions here?
No, I need to keep the microphone.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
No, that's no problem. It's on, yes? I have a caveat and a very naive question.
Yes.
The caveat is I live in East where the data is politically structured and inaccessible or censored in one way or another. But I can understand it in a US context. It just seems to me that the data should be in the hands, not in the hands, but it should be monitored by the city governments if they really are interested in good government. So what kind of pressure could citizens, residents make on a city government with this data?
So let me, if I understand your question. So first of all, we do have to be aware that all big data has its idiosyncrasies, right? And there's some things that, for example, crime data in Los Angeles is very good at telling us. There's other things that it's not good at. And we know that, for example, incidents of domestic violence are woefully underreported and so forth. Some neighborhoods have different relationships with the police, and which makes them less willing to report crimes and stuff like that. So we have to go into it understanding that there are these cultural nuances that could impact the data, and we just have to be transparent with our audience about the limitations of the data. But in terms of what the data can sort of allow residents to demand, in North Carolina, in Raleigh, for example, Raleigh has a great database of potholes, where potholes are being filled. I wish we had that in LA. But if I could get neighborhoods to fight with each other over who gets more potholes filled, then I would put that on my tombstone, I think, because I think that's kind of the apotheosis of local journalism, of then citizens holding their government accountable, asking for change and for more services and better services once they can see that, say, the rich folks got more potholes filled than the poor folks and stuff like that. So hopefully it brings that transparency to it.
We actually had that exact thing happen. The city put in a new portal where you could complain about your sidewalk not being even or accessible, and we queried that data, and right after we queried it, they shut down the portal because they realized the inequity of where sidewalks were being reported and where they were being fixed was all in the rich neighborhoods where it might have been like a little divot or something, whereas in other neighborhoods they weren't being fixed or reported. So anyway, it's interesting that data does have power. We had the similar thing with Durham police. Durham has a bad crime problem, and their data was not being updated regularly, like a year or something behind. And so by us keeping going, they do it more regularly now. So.
Yeah, we found that too, that we're often looking and finding that the agency has not posted its data. We complain, we raise a stink. It eventually gets up there.
Mm-hmm.
It was him before. I'm gonna come to everybody.
Do you think to expand your service in Europe?
So the technology will work where there's data. I suspect that, for example, France has good data, Germany has pretty good data. I have some doubts about data in Italy at the sort of local level, but where there's data, this will work. And it doesn't have to be this kind of data. You can also generate satellite data so that you're looking at, heat islands and stuff like that. There's a lot of other options for that. The point is that we can localize that data, and then we can deliver that data to local audiences and hyperlocal audiences.
Can you tell us something about the number of subscribers in the LA market and also the terms of monetization over there?
Sure. So we are based out of a university. We're a nonprofit newsroom. And we are not really sort of playing a numbers game. What we're trying to do is sort of prove out a hypothesis. So we have fewer than 2,000 subscribers. The number has steadily grown. The churn has been pretty low. What we often find is that sometimes people subscribe to 5 newsletters at first and then pare it back to 2 or 3. But the open rate has maintained steadily above 80%. So, and we don't monetize that because, again, we're at a university. It's difficult to sort of run a business out of a university. But our goal is to spin this out and then make it available to as many newsrooms as we can, because we think that it, again, can bring costs down, open up new opportunities for engagement, and generate new revenue.
And I think the revenue could come in different ways. Sponsorship for the newsletter, for example, or like I talked about, a premium tier membership sort of form.
And even as an advertising product, there's the opportunity to advertise in 5 neighborhoods, but not the other 12 in Raleigh or something like that, if you're a restaurant or something, and to chart your ROI on a sort of neighborhood basis.
I guess I'm going to ask the AI question since you brought it up. I realize automation and AI are confounded, but just interested in what you think the opportunities are. Also with the current hype and the sort of, are you planning on adding generative AI, or is it just a general thing of using the opportunities of the technology shift?
Sure. So, excellent question. When you have all this data, the opportunities to create AI products are immense, right? Because we've got all this training data. So we've experimented. People might remember in the United States, like newspaper world, there was this feature called the crime blotter, right? So that would be that local newspapers would do this. They'd send some junior reporter down to the police station and look at who'd been arrested the night before, and, you know, old Farmer Johnson got drunk and, you know, shot up the tree, stuff like that, and they print that in some little small thing. It was kind of good to read, et cetera. We've done an AI version of that where we look at all LA crime records and we pull out elements that are of statistical anomalies. So, for example, it pulled out this one record. There were 17 cars stolen from the same block at the same time. What happened was somebody went and held up a parking garage and cleaned it out of cars, right? So anomalies like that pop up to us, and then we can write about sort of crimes of the weird. But we've also used that 12 years of crime data to create prediction algorithms for what is likely to happen in a particular neighborhood, what might go up, what might go down, and stuff like that. We also, for 1 year, we covered every hate crime in Los Angeles. Just a quick little write-up of it. The point was not everyone is sort of newsworthy on its own, but the cadence with which that was happening, we felt was newsworthy because they were rising rapidly. We then basically created a generative AI version of that so that the human being didn't have to go and write that same little blurb. So those are options as well, yeah.
Hi, so this software seems really impressive. It looks very powerful and user-friendly. I wonder if you could talk about the process for developing it and how it was funded.
Sure. So, like Blanche Dubois, we depend on the kindness of strangers. We've received some money from the Google News Challenge. There was a company called Meta that gave us some money. That's not going to happen again. And sort of little bits and pieces. The truth is, like, we ran it very cheaply, and I'll just tell you why. Most of this was built with, we had some computer science faculty who hired a bunch of their computer engineering students at a rate that is a great hourly rate if you're a student, a really crappy hourly rate if you're a software engineer. But that allowed us to get a lot of engineering talent into the pipeline to do this fairly cheaply. Yeah.
And we benefited from that as well. I have a part-time person who will just be working on the newsletter from the last of the meta funding.
Yes.
We won't see that anymore. The local media association was also key in our partnership.
Other questions in the back?
Hi. Yeah, I'm wondering about, I mean, you said in the Los Angeles case, it's 110 neighborhoods that you send out to, and is there not a bit of a risk that it just sort of becomes like numbers without context, because obviously you're not giving context for every 110 neighborhoods. You just give the numbers. It's like maybe people receive it and it's like, okay, 200 cars have been stolen in my neighborhood. It's less than my like the next neighborhood. So
Right.
what, you know, like there's no news or context around it.
So, I mean, occasionally there'll be a neighborhood that has a null set of data, right? There were no instances of this happening. So that is an issue. We address that through our editorial approach, right? So as Ashley mentioned, sometimes we're taking something that's in the news. There was an arson fire or something like that. Let's look at arson across the city. How has that changed? How has that changed in your neighborhood? Even in that case, for example, if there were no cases of arson or almost none, but we've been seeing arson in the news, that's still kind of relevant to those people. So we try to sort of, again, contextualize everything that we do. We do look through neighborhoods and try to figure out, well, which one has the most of this, et cetera. Do we weave that into the storytelling and so on and so forth? So we try to make it relevant for every neighborhood. We had 2 years where every week we were putting out COVID data at the neighborhood level. That was kind of still relevant no matter what. But yeah, I mean, some weeks are better news weeks than others.
Okay.
Sure. We're losing people.
Quick, make it a good question.
I'm so sorry. Okay, are you sure? Thank you. It's really difficult.
Sorry, do you see a difference in subscriber engagement between the more edge case neighborhoods, the extremely rich and the extremely poor, than you do in run-of-the-mill, more average places?
Yeah, so we can look at open rates by neighborhood. So that's a tough question. We're seeing strong open rates in every neighborhood. We're, again, not, I mean, our expertise is not in marketing it to the public. So we don't, because we don't have a large audience. That's something that WRAL is going to be able to do because they're already the market leader in Raleigh. So when they come out with a newsletter, they can talk about it in their broadcasts and stuff like that. But understanding those different open rates and those engagement rates by neighborhood is really interesting. One thing that we have found is that downtown, which has very wealthy and very poor people in it, often has open rates of over 100% because people are forwarding it to other people in downtown and so on and so forth. So it varies, but it doesn't vary tremendously from neighborhood to neighborhood.
I would expect in Raleigh that it will not vary in the way that you're suggesting, just because the television news audience tends to be more of the average person often, so.
Okay.
I think there's the last question.
Last question, anyone here? Nobody? We've answered everything? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank
If
you
want to
all
talk
so
to us,
much.
if you want to sit or anything like that.